Jim, our next question from the Cult of Cornette Facebook group was sent in by Paul Sturgis. In Tim Hornbaker's excellent book, Death of the Territories, it was mentioned how the Sheik was one of the only promoters to help Nick Gulas in his war with Jarrett. Since both were active at the time, any idea if they ever hotshotted the territory with the dream team of magnificent Georges, Captain Ed, and Gulas?
That is kind of funny that both of them had sons that contributed in some fashion to the demise of their company. Although in Captain Ed George's defense, the Sheik's territory was already heading down the hill when he used Captain Ed George on top to begin with, right?
If you talk to anyone that was around the territory, not necessarily the wrestlers, although some of them too, but some will just still be a nice person and not say too much bad stuff. But any of the fans that ask Dave Brzezinski, if you bring up Captain Ed George, you get laughter, you get stories. He'll randomly just send a picture of Captain Ed George to be sometimes mocking him.
See, the thing is, and I mean, I never met him and didn't know him. These people knew him. He apparently was even screwier in person than he was, just watching him on television. But I saw both these guys as I was a fan. So I got the fan experience and heard what the fans thought about him. And with George, it was, at the time, you didn't have to have a physique in wrestling. It wasn't the era of the bodybuilder yet, but you had to look in some fashion like you could do something to somebody. And George, he was 6'4", but he was painfully thin without any muscular definition whatsoever. He was not very coordinated. When a guy would shoot him off into the ropes, it looked like a disconnected bucket of body parts being thrown into the fucking ring ropes. And the fans when they didn't laugh at any wrestlers, when they cheered or booed, depending on whether you were a babyface or a heel, but nobody laughed at anybody and nobody hooted at the matches. George's matches got laughed at and hooted because it was just ridiculous. And he had not only the Gulas accent that was the Gulas family was Greek, but Nick had lived in Birmingham. I don't think he was born in Greece. He was from Birmingham, Alabama, but he had a very strange accent. And George not only had something of that, but also couldn't talk plain. You've heard him.
Yeah.
And so it was like, yeah, that's right. This Tuesday night, I'm going to come down there and I'm going to, it was, and everybody knew that George was Nick's son, the promoter's son, because Nick was the one promoter out of everybody in the territories that his name was plastered all. Nick Gulas presents NWA Wrestling. Nick Gulas and NWA was all over every newspaper ad, television show, whatever.
When George started wrestling, wasn't he George Nick Gulas?
Yes, the first, he got publicity pictures when he was an announcer. He started as an announcer, if you can imagine that, talking that way, and a video recently surfaced of one of the shows that they did here in Louisville, and it was brutal. And then he became a special referee. And in the newspaper ads, they'd have like the Fabulous Kangaroos against Eddie Marlin and Tommy Gilbert be a hot fucking angle. And they would announce that George Nick Gulas was going to be the special referee, and his name was in bigger type than the fucking wrestlers. Because Nick believed that he was going to be, I don't know what he thought he was going to be. But anyway, that when he finally became a professional wrestler, it was see George's pro debut in every town that he wrestled in for the first time. It was like a landmark occasion that Nick thought that they had to be advertised. But that was, I guess he probably started actively wrestling maybe late 73, very early 74. And the fans laughed at it, and it didn't get, there were some fans that were still okay because he's a babyface. We're going to cheer him if he's got a pulse. But he couldn't perform at the standard of anybody else in the territory. And then that's what led to the ill feelings where Nick wanted to move George out of the Nashville, Birmingham end over into the Memphis end that Jarrett was in control of as the booker. And he didn't want to have George exposed to the most successful territory in the territory, or most successful town in the territory. So, and then George wrestled for Nick until pretty much Nick went out of business. That's the only place he ever worked. And I think he went to Detroit a couple times, because you mentioned Sheik and Ed George. The Sheik was loyal to Nick because they had worked together for so many years and been members of the NWA, and the Sheik was another one, thought the NWA was supposed to protect everybody. So that's why you had the pipeline where when Jarrett split off from Nick, the only talent that Nick could get, names, Bobo Brazil, the Sheik, Crazy Luke Graham, Ripper Collins at that time, whatever.
That's when all of a sudden Randy Savage and his family showed up.
Yeah, the Paphos was from Detroit, from the Sheik. And, it didn't fly in Tennessee because the people didn't know they knew the Sheik. Everybody knew the Sheik, but they didn't know everybody else. And it was different style and it didn't work. But that was the pipeline. And when the Sheik, as we've talked about, the promotional war he had going on with Bruiser, Indiana versus Michigan, when that ended, then both territories went down because they couldn't afford to keep the top talent. And by, 75, 76, that's when Captain Ed George showed up. And I was watching those shows because they were on in Cincinnati. And you'd also see the pictures. What the fuck? This is a territory that had the Sheik, Bobo Brazil, Pampiro Firpo, the Mighty Igor, Ernie Ladd, the list goes on. Every major Midwest and national name of the 1960s and early 70s had worked Detroit. And suddenly this fucking guy, who nobody knew was the son of the Sheik, right? That's the difference. Only the really hardcore fans that were there around all the time, a minute number at that point, knew that this was the son of the Sheik. So everybody else had just looking at this fat, untalented fuck that suddenly is the top baby face. What the fuck is going on? And that led to the, many things, but that was one of the many things that led to the downfall of the Sheik's territory. The talent went down, the talent got older, and the towns, got neglected somewhat.
And there's a lot of things you could learn from that, from Nick's usage of George, from the Sheik's usage of George, and from Tony Khan's usage of Orange Cassidy.
Yes, his adopted son.
That's right.
And that's the thing, is that there have been second generation, obviously. Can you imagine if Bob Orton Sr. had said to Bob Orton Jr., no, you can't, there have been great second generation wrestlers. Nick Bockwinkel's father was a wrestler. We're not saying it shouldn't happen, but when the father is a wrestler and is also a promoter, there have been major miscalculations in what the father saw in the son versus what the fans saw in the wrestler.